So in terms of how this class is going to go, it's going to go basically exactly the same way the last one went structure-wise. So we're just going to start out with a brief summary, a brief review of the story. I'm going to try to keep them shorter this time so we have more time for discussion. The idea is to meet here every Monday at 6:30. We pushed it back 15 minutes today because we were a little bit late, but normally it'll be 6:30. The doors at the hallway down there open at 6:15, and then they lock at 6:50. So that's the time window to get here. If you get here any later, then you have to text somebody to come open the doors for you. So for this last time for the C.S. Lewis class, we spent one class going through his life and then another class prepping for the book. This time, I'm going to just see if I can blast through Bulgakov's life and the first two chapters of the book in one class and leave time for discussion. So we'll see if we can get that done. So in terms of the author himself, Bulgakov, let's see. All right, there it is. All right, so this guy, Mikhail Bulgakov, so he was born in Kiev in 1891. He died in 1940, so he lived a relatively short life. Now, both of his grandfathers were Orthodox priests, and his father, Afanasy Bulgakov, was actually a seminary professor at a seminary in Kiev, and he taught Orthodox theology, and he also translated religious texts as well. So, and his mother was a teacher as well. So Bulgakov actually comes from very good stock, and he was raised Orthodox by his grandparents and his parents as well, and he did have siblings. And just like the last author we studied in this class, he was a bit of a child prodigy. He was writing plays as a child, and then him and his friends and his siblings would act them out. So he has the DNA of a playwright. And he developed an early interest in classic literature such as Dostoevsky, Charles Dickens, Gogol. And so he had an appreciation for these things very early on. And he went through some challenges faith-wise after his father died in 1907. So he was a teenager when this happened, very similar to how C.S. Lewis also went through some serious faith crises when his mother died. So during this time period of his life, he became very unstable, and he questioned, of course, the existence of God, but also he went through a whole bunch of other existential crises where he went through phases where at one point he kind of believed that the devil was real but not God, and then at other times he was getting into some weird occult practices. One thing in particular that I think is worth noting is he would have a lot of demonic dreams during this time of his life. One of them in particular is where a demonic snake would be wrapped around his neck, strangling him to death. And the reason that stood out to me is because when we look at the attestation of the saints and what they have during their noetic experiences, if you look at St. Joseph the Hesychast, he actually had a vision of one of his spiritual children getting strangled by a demonic snake. And so the fact that this is actually reported actually doesn't really surprise me. Like, it fits the pattern. So he later went to seances as well during this time, he became more immersed in the newer religious practices that were entering Russia, which was, as everyone knows, predominantly Orthodox. So he later went to medical school, and he graduated from medical school, and he was an army physician. And he served in World War I as an army physician, and he was wounded in his abdomen. And he treated his pain with morphine, and he became addicted to morphine for a time. And it caused kind of a rocky relationship with his wife at the time, because he just wasn't the same guy when he was high on morphine. But he eventually quit his morphine addiction, and he wrote a book about it in the early 1920s called Morphine. And he also then became a surgeon later in Smolensk, which, just for reference sake, Smolensk, this is the same city that when Saint Xenia was alive, the church of Smolensk was being built, and she would secretly carry stones at night to the builders to lighten their task as a virtuous deed that she did in secret. And that happened about 150 years earlier, so just as a reference there. He also served as a physician for the White Army in the Russian Civil War, which actually broke out in 1917. And this is actually important because he would eventually favor them later in his writings, which would get him in trouble with Stalin. So after the war, he dedicated himself entirely to his writing career. and he had some highs and lows. But throughout his life, he was married 3 times during this time period. So I wanted to take a little bit of a detour and go through just his wives real quick, because he had 3 of them. And so, as mentioned, he was married 3 times. So in 1913, he was married to Tatiana. She's the one on top there. And this is the wife that dealt with him during his morphine addiction. During his writing career, when he started taking off, when he got famous, he started turning into a bit of a celebrity, and he started turning into somebody else that she didn't really recognize, and this caused rifts in their marriage. And it really bothered her. And within 1 year, he actually was, within 1 year of getting famous, he met another woman named Lubev. She's the second one down. That's her. That photo was taken when she was much older. When she was younger, she was a ballet dancer. And Bulgakov actually wanted to have her move in with him and Tatiana, but Tatiana, of course, did not allow that. So he ended up just leaving her. But he actually did feel very guilty before God for doing that. So I think at this point, it kind of shows that he kind of knows what's right and wrong, but he still sometimes just chooses the wrong thing to do, and then his guilt kind of torments him. And eventually, he ended up leaving her as well in 1932 for another woman named Elena, who was actually married at that time. But the 2 met in secret, and after a while, Elena decided to leave her husband and her 2 sons to be married to Bulgakov, and he actually based the character in this book, Margarita, after her. So that was his married life. But back to his career. So over the course of his career, most of his works actually got censored, and this left him very, very depressed. And some of his plays actually did very well, such as Days of Turbans. Stalin himself actually went and attended that play over 12 times. And he had personal correspondence with Stalin, who he also had kind of a bit of a rocky relationship with. So Stalin would actually censor a lot of his works, but there were other times where he would actually protect him. So he would censor works like The Run, which was a play that Stalin claimed glorified the White Army too much, namely the opponents of the Bolsheviks. But then, on the other hand, for plays like Days of the Turban, Stalin would protect him because he actually liked that play. So really, according to Stalin, Bulgakov was as good as whatever plays he was writing, and as good as how politically correct his plays were at the time. So he actually then went on, he was driven to the brink of suicide at one point in his career. And he got to the point where he had a gun to his temple, and he was about to commit suicide, but then right when he was about to pull the trigger, Stalin actually called him and said, "Hey, I got a new job for you." And he made him a theater manager for coordinating more plays as opposed to writing. So this isn't exactly what Bulgakov wanted to do, but in the end, it really did turn out that Stalin did this for good PR, because so many writers were getting canceled, and there was starting to be a little bit of an upheaval. And Stalin, just, instead of making Bulgakov disappear like he did with many other writers, he decided to give him a better job, just as a form of social proof, saying, like, no, like, I'm not totally against art. I just, I treat this writer very well. So he, towards the end of his career, he called Stalin and actually told Stalin basically that he was being suffocated and that he could not be a writer in the Soviet Union. It just wasn't working, because about 90% of his works were getting canceled and he couldn't publish them, and which is very frustrating for him, because you imagine you pour your heart and soul into all your projects and then you can't do anything with them afterwards. So he asked Stalin for permission to leave and go to France, where the rest of his family had relocated, and of course Stalin denied it. He didn't want him to leave. And of course he ended up dying later in 1940 from kidney failure. Same thing that actually killed C.S. Lewis, coincidentally. But in terms of his faith, it's hard to say, because he was raised with the faith, but it's hard to say if he kept it, because he went through that really rocky period after his father died. But then when if you read his literature, it's very, very evident that he believes in the devil, he believes in these Orthodox truths, but yet when you look at the way he lived his life, it seems like he had a really difficult time actually living those out. So it's kind of hard to make a definitive statement about his faith. So,
Yeah.
anyway, so this book and setting. So,
One of the few famous examples where people just keep disappearing off of the photograph.
Oh man.
yeah, well, that's what happened here. I mean, so because this was written in the Soviet Union, this is a time of, the Soviet Union ran off propaganda, and many of those themes are actually shown in this book, but I wanted to give an example. So if we look at this photo, so this is an actual photo of Stalin with some of his officials, but you notice on the bottom photo, the official on the right is gone. The photo was edited for the newspapers. And one of the themes you'll see in this book is people disappearing a lot. And when Stalin says he makes people disappear, he really means it. Their bodies aren't found. They are erased from public record. They are erased from public consciousness. There's not even an obituary. They completely wipe them from public record. And this retouched photo is an example of that. So whoever that official was, I don't know who he was. I don't know if anybody really knows who he was. But apparently he, whether he was exiled or executed or whatever, when this same photo came out, they retouched the photo and edited him out completely. So Bulgakov started this work in the 1920s, and he actually burned the first manuscript out of discouragement, which we'll also see a reference to that later in the book. And he ended up rewriting it in the 30s. He was inspired by other supernatural works like Faust, because there's deals with the devil, and also Venediktov, which is where the devil comes and wins people's souls by playing cards with them. Both of these stories were very, very inspiring for him. And this book at the time was too controversial to publish when he was writing it, but after his death in 1940, his third wife, Elena, spent 25 years editing the manuscripts together, and an abridged version was released in 1968 under the Brezhnev administration, or at least when he was the chief secretary of the Communist Party. An unabridged version was eventually released. Well, so the unabridged version was still present, and it was present and circulating in the underground literary circles of the Soviet Union. That those underground literary circles were called the Samanizdat, and basically where manuscripts of these writings were hand copied and passed from reader to reader. And the reason why they had to be hand copied is because every single printing press and typewriter was required to be registered with the Soviet government. And so in terms of his legacy, this book itself that we're about to go through became known as one of the 20th century's greatest literary works, and there are 2 museums in Russia dedicated to Mikhail Bulgakov. And there's also been some music groups that have taken inspiration from this book, most notably Rolling Stones with their song Sympathy for the Devil, which is a song that Guns N' Roses later covered as well. So it's very influential. So moving on to the book itself. So chapters 1 and 2. So for those of you who started reading the book or listening to the book, you'll notice the book starts out in Moscow at Patriarch's Ponds. Now, that's the first reference. You'll notice Bulgakov actually writes a lot of himself into this book. Patriarch's Ponds was the very first place in Moscow that he settled down with Tatiana. So he's using real places right out of the gate. And so we're introduced to 2 elite figures, Ivan and Berlois. And these are 2 editors, 2 writers that work for, they're part of the, I guess you could say the Moscow elite at the time. Because even though communism, everybody's kind of supposed to be on the same level, everyone knows it didn't really work out that way. So they begin and they start having a conversation about Ivan's latest anti-religious poem. And Berlois is criticizing him for depicting Christ as an actual person who lived in history. and he criticized him for making him too lifelike, because the belief system circulating at the time was that Christ never actually existed. So they speak of how Christ was never really a real man. They miscite some various historical sources, like Tacitus and Josephus Flavius, etc. And what I found interesting about this is that this is the exact same argument that we got like 10 years ago with the new atheists, that like Jesus never existed, which is like one of the most historically colossally dumb things to claim. But they tried it, and this argument goes back to the Soviet Union. So we can talk about that more in the discussion if people want to. So now what's interesting about this too is in the normal world, like if you can write a character that's very, very lifelike, that's actually a good thing for a writer to be able to do, because it's a really hard thing to do. But in the Soviet Union, you don't want to do that with certain kinds of historical figures like Christ, and that's one of the things that Bulgakov is showing here. So while they're having this conversation, they are approached by an odd, tall figure who appears to be transparent and levitating, and the two men are just dismissive of this because they see it as just weird, and they just say whatever. Like there's even a part where a guy says "bah, the devil," like whatever, and like who cares? But it actually is the devil. So so once this mysterious figure approaches them, they realize that he's sharply dressed and he's carrying a stick with a poodle head as a handle. Now, what's interesting about this is if you look at Faust, one of the plays that really inspired him, the story of Faust, where God and the devil make a deal for the soul of Faust, who's like the smartest man on earth at the time. They say the devil believes that he can persuade him away from God, and then the devil approaches Faust in the form of a black dog, and that's where this reference is coming from. And then, of course, later in that story, when Faust dies, it turns out God won half the bet, the devil won half the bet, but then Faust's wife actually begs the Panagia to intercede to Christ to save the soul of Faust, and then that kind of tips the scales in God's favor, and then he ends up being saved. It's a very cool play. But this is a little reference to that play in this first chapter here. So, as this... all right. So... as this mysterious stranger strikes up a conversation with these two men, he finds out that they're both atheists, and he's overjoyed because he's the devil and he loves that. And he converses with them about how there's no God or Jesus, and he is doing so in an inquiring fashion. It's almost like he's kind of probing Moscow's spiritual status, kind of the spiritual climate of Moscow. To kind of get a feel for what he can get away with, which I also think is interesting because most of the saints and fathers tell us that the devil's not omnipotent the way God is. He tends to use reeds and tells and all that to find out, and he shoots his arrows, and then based on what you react to, that's how he finds out how he can get you. So I found it interesting that Bulgakov's has the devil not knowing everything right away and actually having to do a little bit of recon. So then they proceed to have a conversation about the 5 proofs of God's existence, which are the Thomistic proofs from the medieval era. Mostly just being first cause, contingency, answering Leibniz's question, gradation, ultimate, which is an ultimate standard of good, design, which is a teleological argument, and then they also talk about the 6th proof, which is from Immanuel Kant, and his proof is basically because human beings, to put it crudely anyways, is because human beings have such an integrated longing for an afterlife and a longing for justice that will never be satisfied in this life, therefore God must exist. And the devil actually starts laughing and says, well, I had breakfast with Immanuel Kant yesterday. And there's a couple of reasons why some people say he said this. One is that the devil had a hold over Kant, which is, I don't know if that's what Bulgakov was saying, but the devil is kind of immortal, and so time kind of blends together for him. So even though Kant was in the 1700s, and this is in the 1900s, it just seemed like yesterday to the devil because he's an eternal being. So now Ivan claims that man actually governs himself. Voland, the devil, explains that mankind he is a relatively recent phenomenon in the universe, and he argues that man is not in full control of himself. And he gives an example of a man who accidentally stumbles in front of a train and dies. And as this conversation about life and death continues, Voland kind of nonchalantly predicts that Berlois will die from being decapitated by a woman, which we'll see later in the book. So Voland then addresses Ivan by his name, and Ivan didn't want to give it to him, and he was suspicious of him. And the devil said, well, I've read your poems, so that's how I know who you are. So because of how inquisitive the stranger Voland seems, the two men were going to ask him for his identification because they expected that he might be a spy. So when they asked him who he was, he simply said, well, I'm a professor of black magic, and explains that he's in Moscow to read some historical manuscripts. So then here we see Voland's inclination to mess with people, because he is a born showman, and he's like a showman in a circus, but he's much more destructive and he's much more dangerous than that. And he proceeds to tell the two men that Christ did exist. And then chapter 2 comes around, and this is where we get into the narrative that takes place in first century Palestine. And so as the narrative switches to that time period, we see Pontius Pilate in the throes of the trial of Christ. And it should be noted that this is Voland's perspective. This is the devil's perspective. So it's not like Bulgakov is trying to rewrite the four Gospels or anything with this. But in this narrative, Christ is being brought before Pilate because Herod didn't want to process him. And Pilate was angered by Joshua because Joshua didn't really address him by his proper title. And Bulgakov is actually drawing parallels here to the authoritarian hierarchy of the Soviet Union. And it's described more explicitly in this part of the book, which takes place in history, rather than explaining it with the current leaders in the Soviet Union, because that would have gotten him killed. So Pilate then begins to talk to Christ about his crimes, his quote crimes, and Joshua says that he is not advocating for other people to destroy the temple, because that's what he was convicted of. And during this conversation, Christ expresses that he cares for all men, which ironically is what makes him alone in the world. And Pilate then asks him about the temple, and Christ says that the temple of the old faith will fall, and a new temple of truth will be built. So Pilate doesn't like this because in his mind, as the judge, his decisions are the truth. So out of sensitivity of time, I'm going to stop my description there. Not able to cover all the details, but if there's any details that anybody noticed that they want to talk about, we can talk about them now.
So I noticed that the story of Jesus is not the story that we get in the Gospels, right? There's a lot of details off, and I wonder if that's if the author is trying to say like this is real within this universe, or if the devil character is telling like a spin on it for his own purposes. Mm-hmm. Like there's like a lot of little things like Jesus like not knowing who his parents are. He's like, I think one was Assyrian, like one was, and I don't know my mom.
And then there's no entrance into Jerusalem. It's just him and Matthew, and nobody's there.
Mm-hmm.
And he also speaks back when he's being tried, because the huge thing is he's quiet in the Gospels.
When he has a fear in his eyes a lot, but in the
Yeah, that's one of the big things is that it's supposed to be the gospel of Satan. So it's everything from Satan's perspective. But then you have to think, like, wouldn't he just lie to you? Like, wouldn't he just try to?
But it also seems like the opposite of the poem, right? Or actually, the opposite of what Berlioz's perspective was, that like you shouldn't try to tell a story of Jesus as actually existing, and the devil is telling a story of Jesus as actually existing, but trying to make him like less divine, more pathetic.
Yeah,
like that is the way you do it.
It's this pleasure too. Why so angry? Like, I watched an episode of Black Mirror, and like, I had never watched Black Mirror for the character. There's like a show being written about her on TV, and it's like a retelling of the day that she had, and it's like almost exactly the day she had, but there's like exaggerations a little bit here and there. And so people that are watching the show then say to her, "Did you really say that? Did you really do that? Did that really happen?" And she can't ever be like, "No, none of that ever happened." It's almost kind of actually what happened, but it's always a little worse. Like, she didn't use that tone of voice, but she did say that. Or like, she like, you know, had to fire someone at her job that was really nice, but in the show it's like she fired her, like, threw her out. It's like, "Did you fire her?" It's like, well, yes, but it wasn't like, you know. So anyway, it was just so much worse because it was like almost.
Outright lies are too easy.
Right.
They're too easy to refute.
Right.
You can smuggle a grain of truth in certain people.
That's why heresy is more dangerous than out paganism.
You had in the first chapter, there's allusions to the death of Berlioz later on. But there's also allusions to who's the other? What's the homeless's first name? Ivan. There's allusions to him in the psych ward, where he says, "You'll have to tell me about schizophrenia yourself."
Yeah.
So there's that moment, and then also like slight spoilers, but Ivan's kind of like the odd one out who he does end up in the psych ward because he doesn't actually like fully commit to the insanity of the Soviet Union that's being described, but he's called homeless. He's not at home.
Yeah, I kind of like how he kind of depicts the devil in a way, because it's interesting how he didn't make the devil come as like a general or a master engineer or a scientist or whatever. He came as a performer. Like, he came as like almost like a trickster figure, and he came as somebody who is able to impress people and charm people, and dress nicely and speak well, and because he could have made the devil anything he wanted. He could have made the devil a politician, but yeah, he chose a black magic performer.
Chapter 1 kind of threw me off a little bit because I'm coming in completely blind. And I said, oh, okay, let's see what happens, like I usually do with most things. And when I'm listening to the story, I listened to chapter 1 maybe 2 or 3 times. So I'm like, what are the names? Let me get these people correct. But for me, I didn't know that was Satan. I didn't know, when this random guy comes in and he's floating, my first inclination is that it's Jesus. And so,
He would let you.
but this is my perspective, right?
Yeah.
Coming in, I'm like, wow, everybody so clearly got that part. I did not, and I'm only in chapter 2. And it reminded me, it was very reminiscent of when Jesus, when he's resurrected, and he says, "You guys go meet me back in Galilee, I'll be back." And remember the 2 guys that's walking on the road and they're talking about him, and he shows up. Remember in the Gospels? And he's talking about him, and he shows up and they're talking, and he's like, "What are you talking about?" And so because the poet and the publisher are talking about Jesus and the guy's writing, then this guy who's floating, clearly that must be Jesus, is saying, "What are you guys talking about?" Me. And now I'm like, oh, that was Satan. Okay. We gotta read a little further. So it's really close to me.
Not to get too down in the weeds, but the first person they see, like the apparition that's floating, isn't actually Volan. That's actually one of his henchmen. And then Volan shows up.
Right, okay, yeah, so I was really okay, go with it, and start coming together. And again, it goes on, now that I'm recognizing that this is all his doings, it goes to exactly what all of you are saying, that there's always a hint of truth in it. And if you read the Gospels, then it's kind of the same, but kind of not the same, that he imitates just enough to where I was like, okay, must be Jesus.
I also didn't know that it was saying when I was listening to it. I was looking at like the notes on YouTube after, which I guess is from the back of the book, and it says like it's the devil. So I'm like, oh, that's it. The devil. Didn't know what I thought he was before that, but then it made sense. I suppose. But it did get a little bit into chapter 3, and it started to sound more, Satan-y. He doesn't sound like super Satan-y yet. I don't know. He just looks a weird dude. I mean, the black magic professor thing, maybe. I thought he was like, I don't know, just a weirdo.
Jesus was coming to, because I was clear in the conversation between the two guys, they were clearly not on board with the Jesus thing. So Jesus shows up to say, hey, here I am, let's talk about it. And that's where I kind of got left off. And then it switched to Jesus with Pontius Pilate. And I was like, of course it's Jesus. There we go.
A Russian wrote this. It's not going to end well.
So this is brand new to me, which is cool.
It's great. I mean, everything's more fun when it's new, and like all the magic is waiting for you. When it's new.
Well, another interesting thing is Volan is actually an old German word for Satan.
Well, he doesn't give his name in the first chapter, right? He's just this professor.
I don't remember. I know that he shows his papers, and
So this was paid.
they talk about his surname having the double V.
Oh yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Why? Because it seems in the first chapter that Bulgakov he puts Immanuel Kant in torment. Like the devil kind of implies that. Like he's somewhere worse than a prison camp, and he's never coming back. He kind of says that. I don't know. I know very little about that. But why do you think, from his perspective, he would imply that as a writer, Bulgakov?
That's a good
Is
question.
he kind of like philosophizing moral virtues, trying to make them secular?
Well, Immanuel Kant was known for two main works: a critique of pure reason and a critique of pure faith. And he was brought up as a Protestant, but then he also became very much a product of the Enlightenment, because he was a Frenchman during he was alive in the French Revolution, and so he was very influenced by those ideas as well. So, and some people actually still debate like where Immanuel Kant himself falls on the spectrum. Like, was he on the Christian side, or was he on the atheist Enlightenment side, or So, I mean, God only knows. But I do know that a lot of Christian apologists like his work because he talked about a priori knowledge and everything, like an implicit sense of morality in man. And I know a lot of Thomistic apologists like to use that as they like to use him as an argument to argue for like objective moral values.
Even the secularists come up with our natural law.
Yeah.
My understanding was Immanuel Kant was the founder of secular humanism.
Well, there's that
So we
too.
would have that as a consequence. If he's arguing that people have innate morality, then what do you need the God for?
He
I
was
think he tried to start his own religion.
a very great character. So as far as starting his own religion, I didn't hear that. I mean, teacher. I only have one of his books. I only read one of his books, so not an Immanuel Kant expert. But from what I understand,
A lot of people like to hate Immanuel Kant. Like it's kind of
he gets heat from
your
both sides.
people's favorite philosophers to hate on. Like
Yeah.
a lot of people can't stand him.
But yeah, he gets a lot of arguments from both sides because the Christians don't like him because he was so integrated in secularism, but also the secularists don't like him because he provided some ammunition for Christian apologists on the moral argument.
All I know is that Ayn Rand was a big atheist and she hated him more than Immanuel Kant.
Yeah, it really depends. One of the Jago, one of the apologists from our old church, really liked him. So
I want to talk like kicks the hole on the wrong side.
yeah,
That's
right. Did anybody have any thoughts on the actual life of Bulgakov itself and how? I mean, I honestly feel that even these first few chapters, we're kind of seeing his own life and just kind of the way his mode of being is kind of reflected in the story. It's kind of like it's here, it's there, it's there's this weird character, there's that weird character, there's these philosophies being batted around, there's these arguments, we're almost like we're getting a glimpse into the guy's mind.
Yeah.
Well, there's like this stultifying, like the literary magazine has a certain line, right? And they're gonna stick with that line. So I think that's like showing the party line kind of nature of Soviet life.
Yeah, and a lot of it too is he was trying to also show the insanity of the Soviet Union within the narrative itself. And he does it in a way that's not obvious, because he's not like preaching through his characters or anything, but he's just through the circumstances of the story and through the craziness of some of the characters, he's kind of showing just the radical craziness of the Soviet Union at the time. It's almost like his indictment of it, but in a much more subtle way, because he doesn't want to lose his job. So.
Like 90% of this book is a satire of the Soviet Union, including the portions where it's written about Jerusalem and Christ. Like those are like superimposed back into him talking about the Soviet Union.
Yeah, it's basically the Russian equivalent of Virgil. Because Virgil was in a similar predicament under Caesar Augustus. And like in the Aeneid is a response, it's anti-Caesar, if you read it properly.
So was this book banned or wasn't it? I forget now.
Well, it never got published until the 60s, because
Like after Stalin died, his last wife was able to publish the book.
And he never made it out. He never made it into the U.S. Star.
Yeah.
He had 49 million dollars.
But like even the first scene where it's just the two guys on the bench is like an allegory for his own life, where Berlioz is like basically telling the poet he can't publish his work and that he needs to rewrite it.
Yeah.
Like he's censoring the guy right then and there.
And they're having to do it discreetly.
Yeah, in a park.
While they chose a public place to have the conversation. It's at a time of day, like it's in the middle of the summer, so it's hot. And then the whole irony of they can't really find good acceptable food. So just knowing they go through, the store says they have all this stuff, but in the end, the bottom item is
They walk up to the stand and it's got all these things that it has, and then they're like, we don't have anything. And they got one thing. It's like, it reminded me of like when people write about like North Korea. Like they have like fake food displays, but there's not actually any food there.
I remember who I thought the devil character was in The Stranger. I thought he was government agent sent to watch them.
Well, they thought that. I read this.
I thought he was. I thought he was very like. I think there was moments, if I remember correctly from the audio, but I seem to remember there being moments where they were like a little worried at who he might be, and I'm like, obviously, like he was the guy that was like sent to jail, and now he's going to arrest them, and he's like toying with them before he, like they have like some actually cultured person in their servant, and his job is to go and like knock people down.
But also very much maps on the idea of the devil, because from up front you hear it's a foreigner. So knowing he only loses the idea he's a foreigner and they think he's a Russian once they're talking for a while. So once he knows the lay of the land enough where he can blend in, that's kind of a great move.
There's kind of like Bulgakov's style of doing humor in that moment where he describes this. He had a crooked smile and a cap over half an ear, and one eye was black and soulless, and the other eye was green, and he wore a checkered shirt.
Yes.
And he says something. To put it simply, a foreigner. Just. And then there's also the back and forth where both of the two writers keep guessing as to what country he's from. Both of them different and both of them wrong continually, like in pairs. So there's a lot of those kind of little small moments of his humor as he goes through describing different things in the book. So And I was confused by not confused, but something that's like paradoxical in his life, in the life story, is that he seems to almost kind of like martyr himself on this idea of writing and like actually doing satire. So he's clearly pursuing some form of virtue in that he writes in his letters, I can't live without this. Either send me away, kill me, do something, because I can't live with needing to write but then not getting published, in his letters. But at the same time, he's not faithful to his wives.
Yeah.
So he's more faithful to literature than he is to his marriages.
It's his own vision of himself.
What's this?
It's his own vision of himself, also.
The book, you mean?
No, that is, to be a writer is it's a fulfillment of his own self-image.
Well, it's not unusual for like some men to like take a really strong moral stand on their career, but not necessarily take that same moral stand throughout their entire life. I think of like a lot of the big titans and whatever. Like I don't know, like they feel very morally about their career. Like I'm sure if you try to stop Elon Musk from launching rockets, he would, fight till his dying breath. But there's many women that he's had children with in many different kinds of circumstances.
There you go.
But I think that's what's the irony about him and his writings and his upbringing, his background, is that he has this Orthodox background, but yet he doesn't practice, but he's aware of it. And what would make, kind of like with my brother Isaiah was saying, what would make it so frustrating that your work is not being published is because you're not getting acknowledgement. And that's exactly what Satan needs, is acknowledgement. And so on one hand, he's frustrated because if you genuinely did it for the love of doing it, you wouldn't care who saw it. So kind of like, we say with St. Mary's of Egypt. She was so pursuing of God that she didn't need anybody to see her, which is exactly what God did, is make sure we all know her and saw her and see her now. So if he really truly was inspired to make it to where I'm just doing this from the love of my heart because this is who I am and what I'm made to do, it would make a difference if Stalin allowed it to be published or not. But that wasn't his intent, which is why he became frustrated, because he needed acknowledgement. So,
The whole lot, he would have just written all of them. The whole lot of them would have just been like left in a shelf and then later posthumously published, and just all of them would have been smash success here.
And he would have been fine with it because it was just for the love of doing the artwork, right? He's obviously into
It's more like This like Tolkien was terrifying. So he looked at everything and then
But again, then
keels over and
he rewrote this. He's back to everything, And 10 years later,
I think obviously like we're all capable of compartmentalizing. Like that's kind of like the whole idea of being a sinner in the first place. It's like, yeah. So like, say there's 10 things you're supposed to do, hypothetically, right? Like we're all experts at like acting like there's only 6 or only 5 or only 8. And as long as we feel really good about how well we're doing at those 5 or those 7 or those 8, we can feel a lot better about the 2 or the 3 that we're like not doing so well at, It's like, well, at least I'm not doing that. I'm not doing those, I think people feel like they're often doing really good at measuring up to like the 6 commandments,
I haven't killed anyone.
Yeah. The first wife, he was married to the longest.
And she stuck with him through that movie.
She stayed with him through like all of his hardest times, and then he got famous and started going to all these famous parties and met the girl who was a ballerina and
Well, think how exciting it would be
like
to go
that.
to a party.
When I read about his like marital life, I was like, man, this guy, he needs a good slap.
She didn't fit the narrative of how he saw himself to get the acknowledgement. He thought he was entitled to have. And isn't that what Satan needs? He needs to be acknowledged. That was the very thing that got him in trouble. Lucifer's very thing was, I will be like the Most High God, and that's what got him in trouble.
Well, this happens with actors all the time. Like, it's like I'm gonna do like really gritty work and feel like change people, and then especially if they like have a Christian background, like yeah, I'm gonna do this work that nice, and then they go and they get the chance to do a role that like doesn't help the kingdom at all. I'm like, yeah, but it's good though, like it's gritty, and then it's like, yeah, but why? This doesn't help anyone. Yeah, but the reason they do it is because it's a special role. Like that is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, one person that it's a bit of an extreme example, but I like it because it makes it fun. Sometimes I would compare him in a way to like Oscar Wilde, because Oscar Wilde was very tuned in. Like Picture of Dorian Gray was insanely profound. The Ballad of Reading Gaol is insanely profound. But yet the guy himself was a complete and total degenerate, at least for the majority of life. So maybe like the last couple of weeks, like he was about to die, and then some say he repented to a priest, but who knows? But I mean, he did like awful things with like children that said. Whereas like Bulgakov, I don't think he did anything that egregious, but he definitely didn't stay married. And also the whole concept of oftentimes crazy and brilliant do go hand in hand. I think anybody who's spent enough time around enough artists will know that. And it's me. I mean, Bulgakov tends to just fit that mold perfectly. Like he went through a weird time when he was a young man, like go through all that esoteric cultic stuff, and then went through a few marriages, which will drive anybody insane, and then out pops this book. But there's some profound Orthodox truths in this book.
I guess somebody said like righteousness isn't always so hard to understand. It's just really hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, easy. It's very, very true. Yeah. But also too, I mean, the pressures of his time as well. He was, in all fairness, like to be charitable to him, he was living in one of the most oppressive regimes in the history of Earth, where he cleaned the practices. I mean, granted, we can say he should have just been martyred, but yeah, easier said than done. Yeah.
He was married 3 times every time he got married.
So where is
I don't know if that counts, but
He probably could have. Well, maybe. How did you get married in the Soviet Union?
But he was like a weird character too, that he felt he was being followed by the devil. Like he felt like he was being like his dreams and stuff. Like he felt like they were like demonic like attempts, and then that like he was almost being eaten alive by the devil. Like the fact that he almost killed himself, and then he got a phone call, a personal phone call from Stalin. Is this because
Like, why would you automatically go to that Satan is the one that's providing the opportunity? Regardless whether it was Stalin or whomever, but it's like his go-to was that Satan did it, like providing him that. Instead of like, why didn't
I don't know if he was providing it. I think he felt like he was being tortured, being a writer who couldn't do anything. He felt like his life was not good.
even as still like is Orthodox, all things is from God. So whether either still God allows Satan, you know what I'm saying? Like how from an Orthodox perspective, God is omniscient and He is all knowing. So why would He not automatically think that okay, if Satan is tormenting me, God allowed it, so I'm going to move in. Like why isn't God the first center? Why is it Depression did it?
Yeah.
Oh.
And I think like these are some dark times. Right, he was in World War I. What time did he believe that Satan existed but God didn't? Mike, at what period in his life did he believe that Satan existed but God didn't?
Yeah, that was when he was in his late teens, early 20s.
Because that would have been late teens, or about 20 years old. That would have been about 1911. Okay, that's a little early for World War I, but I don't know. People, if you look through World War I and then the rise of the Soviet Union, it's hard to keep your
It
faith.
is the death of his father, but I think if I'm recalling right, the text in front of me.
He actually constructed his own proof for God, which was that I believe basically he believed in the devil, and his reasoning to believe in God was that he believed in the devil. If the devil existed, then God must exist.
Yeah.
And that's like a really backwards way of going about it. It's like,
It
It's
is.
just similar to something. To a degree, is similar to the argument that even Jordan B. Peterson makes. It's like evil exists, infinite evil exists. Surely something on the other side must exist.
Well, what's so interesting about that is to share a personal story. Is when I was like 16, I actually went through that same thing for a few months, where I was thinking to myself, I don't know if God's real, but I know evil's real. I know the devil's real. I actually kind of went through a little phase where I believed in the devil, but not God. It didn't last long.
Yeah, and I believe that the devil was God.
Was almost a version of
Yeah, isn't that
Which
just
got
believing
aliens.
like this universe would be hell then? Like we're just all in hell. We're already in hell.
I mean, it would be like playground.
No, it's bad, and it just gets infinitely worse.
Basically, honest.
Some Calvinists somewhere felt that.
So there's a lot of anti-Calvin sentiment in the room.
Well, it almost killed him there,
But we had to be that way.
Yeah, well, so that, now, you have the hard copy of the book with you, right? Isn't there a first line that opens that talks about how all bad things ultimately happen for good? I'm trying to remember if that's this book or not. Yeah, if you can.
Like in the first.
Yeah, I think the very first page, so not the first chapter, but like.
There's a quote from Faust on that
Yeah,
first page.
it's a book about, can somebody read that?
Yeah. Who are you then? I am part of that power which eternally wills evil and eternally works good.
Yes. So, that is something that, I do remember looking at it. I should have had that written down, but Bulgakov, he really loved that quote because, this is a story of redemption. But there's a lot of wacky craziness and suffering that happens in it as well. So the idea of the one who eternally wills good but allows all this evil to happen ultimately for a good in the end, how we understand it, we don't know, but that is something that kept Bulgakov alive.
Can you say that again?
This theism is the belief that a God is not wholly good and can even be considered evil.
Something that pagan. But thanks for looking at up.
Like, can you say that point again about this quote? Like, who you what was your conclusion about it?
So that quote is basically saying that even through like all the madness and craziness and suffering, God is ultimately weaving like a master plan to ultimately bring about good.
Well, that wouldn't be God. It couldn't be talking of God because it says wills evil, right?
Well, the quote is about the devil, right?
It's the Indians.
Yeah, it would have to be. The devil might work good, but the fact that tension is evil, that predicate doesn't even matter.
Well, it sounds like I haven't read Faust, but it sounds like that's the devil is making a statement about like God's like ultimate power. He's saying, "I try to will evil eternally, but I'm stumped, and I end up working for good. Like I end up crucifying Christ and ending death."
I think that's
The point that Pontius Pilate makes, Christ, was he's like, are then all people good? And he lists examples of ugly men, like, including like Matthew the tax collector. And Christ always comes back and says there is always an underlying good. Everybody's good.
He said even the guy
Yeah, so coming from Faust, he, remember just the overall arc of that story is like all these crazy horrible things happen to Faust. So like it's almost like a Job story in a way, not quite as close, but he loses, he gets tricked by the devil into doing all these awful things, and like he loses his wife and he loses everything, but then in the end, through the intercessions of the Panagia, his soul gets saved. But yeah, and that's we see a similar trope, I guess you could say, in this book. I mean, you finished it, right?
No, I got a decent way. We only like to the midpoint.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, cool. It'll be fun to finish.
Is the original Faustus, is that Goethe?
Yeah.
Okay, because there's also an English play But that's not the original, right? There's like a Shakespearean contemporary that Marlowe has a Dr. Faustus. Yeah,
Okay.
it's actually really I like it a lot.
Marlowe's very good. It's better than Shakespeare.
What? Okay. Oh, this fight.
They are better.
But so it's older than Marlowe then. Marlowe's not the original.
What year was Marlowe again?
Like 1500.
Yeah. This
Okay, we're about here.
is this 1740.
Marlowe is the original.
So,
Oh yeah.
second, if you Marlowe tends to do copies of original things. So Marlowe and Shakespeare never did something original. They're always
There's like some. He's drawing on like some previous myth.
yeah.
That Shakespeare actually hijacked a lot from Spencer, but
And Marlowe. Yeah. You read Marlowe. Did it even exist?
So I have the Marlowe one, but not the Goethe one. But Goethe is who everyone talks about. But he's a German.
Yeah. I find the whole, every time someone's making a gray area, like, what I got a lot out of what I'm hearing about Bulgakov is the need to make gray area, because that's what everyone who hasn't chosen to just choose the good must do to reveal a little better about yourself.
Like, oh, my gray is beautiful.
Yeah.
well, and Russians love that too. I mean, he was very inspired by Dostoevsky, and Dostoevsky loved to play with that gray area. Like Crime and Punishment, like the only overtly Christian character in that story is a prostitute. And like in the very end of that story, Raskolnikov is basically shipped off to prison, and he's writing, saying like, if only my God could be her God, if only my faith could be her faith. And it's like, and it turns out she's doing this work for supposedly a greater good, but then it's like, is that justified? And then Dostoevsky loves to kind of play with that. So
Dostoevsky is very much a tortured soul. that very similar.
But then you have the Didache being like, look, there's two paths.
yeah.
There's two roads, two paths, pick a side.
Yeah. So I always think that like modern American Christian writers would never do what Dostoevsky did. Like you could never publish any like Pureflix would never publish a movie where a Christian prostitute. Like, because then everyone would say, "Well, are you okay? Are you saying that prostitutes it's okay for Christians to be prostitutes?" Like that's not what Dostoevsky's saying. He's reflecting a time period and telling a story.
But we're also just like way more. It's like way, even though people aren't better, it's like way easier to be good if you wanted to be in modern America, because like we're so much more comfortable and safe. Like if you were in St. Petersburg in 1880, maybe if you're not a prostitute, your family dies, and then like life gets gray pretty quick. It's like in America, you go work at Chipotle. Like that's your. It's like just a very different life.
But with the faith, like the temptation to just kind of ride that line of like kind of Christian is easier in a way.
Yeah, I think that does make sense. It also definitely makes things a little more, I don't want to say interesting, because there are some overtly Christian stories that are very powerful and awesome. But also, speaking in the context of modernity, we do run the risk of being perceived as propaganda if something is just so overtly Christian. If that makes sense.
Yeah. There's a lot of trash writing here.
I want to see people, like, I'd like to see what people do think. Well, I probably did see Man of God, and I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful.
Like, yeah, so I'd be curious to know what people's reactions can be toward it when they are not Orthodox.
Very interesting philosophy. This just be goodism. Like we could just
doesn't justify anything. You're kind of borrowing.
what?
You're borrowing. Just be good doesn't.
You mean like on the Christian speech?
Well, like people, like why aren't people just good instead of holding on to a mix? Are you referring to that only in terms of art or in general?
I think yeah. Because obviously, like, if there are a couple of things that you're holding on to, it's because they're not easy to let go of. You know, and even St. Mary, Egypt, she clearly had made a choice of what path she was going to choose, but the reason she had to run off to the desert all those years is because how hard it was to stay away from those things. Yeah.
And that's I think that's part of the reason why monastics do what they do.
Mm-hmm.
They isolate themselves so they don't have as much temptation, but still find them.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just not like in the same way.
But it
No,
issues.
many times it definitely doubles down. We live in the desert. All but no humans contention. Success. Demons. Lots of demons. It's just like,
No, I was there years ago, and I can't remember the name right now. A Chinese pastor was being imprisoned and mistreated and abused for many, many years in China back in the day. And it was just so horrific. When he finally got out, make a long story short, he made it to America and he started sharing the gospel. And he thought that Americans were so weak and they had so many resources and so much freedom. Like, what is your struggle? Like, this is ridiculous. And through prayer, he realized that because we have so much fake freedom, spiritually is very fake and is very deceiving, that he had to pray more for us because there is so much spiritual attacks that people don't even notice because there is so much seemingly freedom. Where in other countries like in the Soviet Union or in China or North Korea, they have to hide and they have to pray and use their mouth and not have words come out because they may be in prison or be beaten or their families killed. We get to worship so freely, but it's not real. Because the truth is, when you have so much freedom, what do you really do with it? Do you take that free time and actually worship God? Or do we get distracted with other things, which we do? And other people can't. So what seems like it's easier.
Is it equally hard to follow God everywhere?
That's a great question, and I would say is as equally as difficult everywhere. It just looks differently. And and we look at one place and we see it like, wow, it's so admirable. You will die if you worship. You would die if you go and you have your icons out. Look how all the Greeks suffered and they had to bury them because they couldn't worship freely with their icons that they carried. How many stories have we all heard with the Greeks? They carried them on the plane and they walked through the desert and the trees and they have these miraculous, beautiful stories that they heard. But on one hand, now we're here and people don't even know what the icons look like. They don't have them. What's left? They had to dust them off if they can find them. But their papos and their yayas were over there struggling just to hold on to them. That's the cost of freedom.
Well, it's like when Isaiah was talking about the demons appearing to tanks in the desert. It's like the demons do that when they're losing. The demon's gonna jump out and try to give you non-fasting food or beat you when they're losing. That's all they got, right? They'd rather just get you watching some weird TikToks.
So much easier for them.
Easy.
hey, keep throwing a prayer. What about this cat? Yeah.
So you're really happy. And that's what I love about this author is his history of Orthodoxy, but the confinement of the Soviet Union at that time period and what he was and was not able to do. And yet, what did he actually do? But we're talking about it, so he did it all.
Yeah, well, I mean, he produced a very good book.
I love it.
You know his name. You can at least pray.
I think so. That's been an hour of class. So I guess we can continue talking, but let's just say a prayer to the fun here, and then we can continue talking. And afterwards, a group of us are going out to quiz. So it is truly meet to call you blessed. Ever heard of him and said, "Look in the Lord our God." More honorable than the cherubim, young compare, more glorious than the seraphim, you who without corruption gave birth to God the Word, and have truly Theotokos, thee do we magnify. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.